Mr. President, we thank Roger Waters for his analysis of the history of the Ukrainian crisis and his assessment of the significance of the Minsk agreements for the relevant diplomatic efforts. Today marks exactly 10 years since the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2202, which approved the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Having thus spoken in favor of the interchanges found a few days earlier in Minsk, the Council took their implementation under its control. However, the hopes for a lasting peace that we all had at that time were not to be realized. Moreover, today the phrase Minsk agreements has become something of a diplomatic euphemism that replaces the words failure or deception. We believe that our Council has every reason to analyze why this happened and why peace in eastern Ukraine did not come after that. First of all, I would like to briefly remind you that the 13 points of the package of measures unequivocally determined the sequence of specific steps to normalize the situation in Ukraine and return the LPR and DPR to it. The last of them was the restoration of Kiev's control over the state border in the east of the country. In order for this to happen, the Ukrainian leadership needed to take a number of steps aimed at granting the LPR and DPR broad autonomy and protecting the identity of the Russian-speaking population. However, it soon became clear that the nationalist Kiev regime, which came to power as a result of an anti-constitutional coup in 2014, initially did not plan to fulfill any of the points of the document. We are well aware of what happened in Minsk at the meetings of the Trilateral Contact Group, how the Kiev representatives deliberately and consistently sabotaged the talks. We talked about it all the time. No one listened to or heard us. Some Ukrainian officials did not hesitate to say in plain text that since the Minsk agreements were largely the result of the pressure of critical circumstances and external factors, the force of their binding rests solely on the goodwill of Ukraine, and the main and only stratagem of the Ukrainian state is to gain time and accumulate strength. V. Gorbelin, advisor to the President of Ukraine. Representatives of the Kiev regime described the commitments they signed as a noose around Ukraine's neck. Leonid Kravchuk, former President of Ukraine, and Dead History, Alexei Reznikov, Ukrainian Defense Minister. They argued that the agreements could not be implemented on Russia's terms. Dmytro Kuleba, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and in general, their implementation means the destruction of the country. Andriy Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. They clumsily concluded that the agreements are not legally binding, allow for the possibility of different interpretations, Vladimir Zelensky, and need to be reformatted, Alexei Reznikov. During the Council's meetings, we have repeatedly drawn attention to these unacceptable statements and to the inadmissibility of Kiev's sabotage of the document approved by the Security Council resolution. We called on all members of our body responsible for maintaining international peace and security to unequivocally demand that the Ukrainian leadership fulfill its obligations. However, our Western colleagues consistently avoided this and even tried to address claims to Russia for non-compliance with the package of measures, although our country was not a party to it and did not bear any obligations under it. Later, the true reason for their line became clear. As it turned out from the confessions of former high-ranking politicians, specifically Angela Merkel, Friedrich Hollande, and Petro Poroshenko, the Western sponsors of the Kiev regime needed the Minsk agreement solely as a smokescreen to arm Ukraine and prepare it for war with Russia, which eventually forced us to start a special military operation in Ukraine almost 3 years ago. We have repeatedly said in this hall, and not only in this room, that if the Minsk agreements had been implemented in good faith by Ukraine and its sponsors, there would have been nothing that followed. By ignoring the unequivocal signals that the Kiev regime is not going to comply with UN Security Council Resolution 2202, Western states have completely failed an important mission of the Security Council, which they emphasize in many other country situations, preventive diplomacy. Today they are trying to deny all this, but we all understand that 10 years ago, it was in their hands that the tools and levers that made it possible to guarantee a peaceful resolution of the internal Ukrainian crisis provoked by the unconstitutional coup d'etat in Kiev in February 2014. But not only did they not take advantage of them, but they also tried to spur Ukrainian nationalism and the Russophobia it engendered, thus creating all the conditions for a direct confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. In the end, by sowing the wind, they reaped the storm. Mr. President, today we can state that the deliberate sabotage of the implementation of the Minsk package of measures had fatal consequences for Ukraine. Ukraine not only missed the chance for peace and restoration of control over Donbass, but also deliberately did not use the best way to resolve the internal conflict. The opportunity to turn Ukraine into a civilized state, where respect for the rights of all citizens is carried out without any discrimination on political, linguistic or national grounds, was lost. Instead, Kiev has chosen the path of confrontation, repression, suppression of freedom of speech and other human rights and freedoms. As a result, Ukraine today is bitterly called by many of its fellow citizens the Zelensky concentration camp. At our previous meeting, we provided concrete evidence of what this country has become. Having missed the opportunities provided by Minsk, the Kyiv regime was unable to grasp the agreements based on the Minsk package of measures, which were reached in Istanbul just a month after the start of Russia's NWO in Ukraine. Today in Kyiv, they are biting their elbows, realizing that the conditions of Minsk are already an unattainable bar, and the new conditions for the end of hostilities for Ukraine will be much worse. But the past can no longer be returned. Not only Zelensky and his corrupt clique are fully responsible for such a situation, but also the sponsors of the Kyiv regime, who actively persuaded him to get involved in a suicidal war with Russia for the Ukrainian state. Mr. President, we all see what processes are taking place in the world today after the Republican administration came to power in the United States. As we have been urging for many over the past months, diplomacy has finally come into play, and there is a chance that the hot phase of the Ukrainian crisis may soon end. Naturally, all those who are now working on this are analyzing, among other things, all previous attempts to put an end to the armed confrontation in eastern Ukraine. Among the most important of them, of course, are the Minsk agreements. What lessons should today's negotiators learn from a process that failed so ingloriously 3 years ago? Let's try to answer this question. First, today we understand that the guarantors of Minsk and the EU countries and the UK as a whole are absolutely incapable of negotiating and cannot be a party to any future agreements on the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. They are blinded by cave Russophobia, a maniacal desire to defeat our country on the battlefield at the hands of the surviving Ukrainians. Today's European elites, unfortunately, are basically incapable of thinking strategically and imagining any security equations involving Russia, because for many years, secretly or openly, they have been building exclusively anti-Russian political and military configurations. We do not know how long it will take to cure them, and whether it is possible in principle, but it is clear that they will not turn out to be any guarantors or even intermediaries. This is confirmed by the reckless, bellicose and unrealistic statements that we heard from European participants during the just concluded Munich Security Conference. Second, a ceasefire and the freezing of the Ukrainian conflict along the line of contact are not in themselves guarantees of its settlement. This is the most important lesson of Minsk, and it should be learned by those who will work today on the new contours of possible agreements. Moreover, European political dwarfs do not hide the fact that in the event of a ceasefire, they intend to rearm Ukraine and prepare it for a resumption of war. Suffice it to quote the new chief diplomat of the European Union, Ms. Callas, who said in Munich that the EU should reallocate some resources to ensure the continuation of hostilities by Ukraine. Comments, as they say, are superfluous. Well, this is the EU's diplomacy today. If you trust it with at least some aspect of the Ukrainian settlement, then nothing will definitely remain of Ukraine. Third, the root causes of the Ukrainian conflict must be addressed in order to establish lasting peace in Ukraine. Minsk's goal was to give such autonomy to the east of the country and such guarantees to the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine that Donbass would return to Ukraine. This concerned education in the Russian language and the opportunity to profess canonical orthodoxy and the right to honor those heroes who liberated Ukraine from Nazism, and not those criminals who, together with the Nazis, killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, Roma, and Ukrainians. Not those who are worshipped in Ukraine today, led by Stephen Bandera, whom Richard Waters mentioned today. All this remains relevant, with the only difference that Ukraine has now irretrievably lost not only Crimea, but also the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, which became part of Russia. Accordingly, it is necessary to correct the situation in those regions that still remain under the control of Kiev. Finally, it is necessary that the implementation of new agreements should be carried out by the government that will be sincerely interested in this and which will appear as a result of democratic elections. Zelensky, who poses as the Ukrainian president, lost his legitimacy in May last year. In addition, having been elected by 3/4 of Ukrainians for promises to achieve peace in the East, he did exactly the opposite and dragged the country into a conflict for foreign geopolitical interests, the victims of which were hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. It is clear that neither he nor his associates, nor those who opposed the Minsk agreements, should play any role in the new Ukraine. This, in fact, is clear from public opinion polls in this country, which clearly indicate that the Zelensky gang has lost even the symbolic support of its citizens. That is why the professional Ukrainian comedian and former president is afraid of elections like fire and is trying in every possible way to delay this moment. And the last thing is that the future Ukraine should be a demilitarized neutral state that is not part of any blocs and alliances. After all, as our American colleagues, in particular President Donald Trump, are already admitting today, it was the prospect of Ukraine's accession to NATO that became the trigger of the crisis. This, I think, is clear to everyone. There are also other important elements of future agreements that do not directly concern Ukraine. We will not touch on them here today. Mr. President, I would very much like to hope that the 10th anniversary of the adoption of UNSC Resolution 2202 will be a good occasion for our European colleagues to finally return to reality and stop provoking Zelensky and his accomplices to senseless resistance. He himself, striving to preserve power and his own skin at any cost, is ready for any provocations as long as hostilities continue and his compatriots die. This is evidenced by such new recent clumsy provocations of the Kyiv regime as the UAV strike on the sarcophagus of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the shelling of IAEA inspectors who were on their way to rotation at the ZNPP. If you do not finally pull back your protege in Kiev and put him in his place, this will not end well for Ukraine. And the parameters of the settlement that we are discussing now will seem like a pipe dream to the Ukrainian authorities after a while. The same as the Minsk agreements that it itself disrupted are for the Kiev regime today. Thank you for your attention. Mr. President, this is a very indicative meeting today. I would like to thank our European colleagues and their allies for the fact that in their speeches today, they have once again vividly demonstrated the complete detachment of European diplomacy from reality and its inability to make any analysis. This diplomacy lives in the past and will remain there. Its task today is to prolong the agony of the Kyiv regime as long as possible, in the hope that this regime will be able to weaken Russia. Colleagues, continue to live in this unrealizable illusion, and we will move on and resolve this crisis one way or another. Our British colleague taught us lessons today. I would advise her to learn the material part better before coming to these meetings. The Minsk agreements were concluded not between Ukraine and Russia, but between Ukraine and the DPR and LPR. Read the documents, look at the text, it is available. Now everyone is trying to shift from a sore head to a healthy one, accusing Russia of not fulfilling the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements, which we tried in good faith to force Ukraine, but which constantly sabotaged them with the support of its Western sponsors. And the fact that we are blamed for blaming the demise of the Minsk agreements is just a medical fact. Because by that time the Minsk agreements, which you all sabotaged here, you are the Western countries, you are the guarantors of the Minsk agreements, they are dead. Thanks to you. Thank you for your attention.